All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to Happy Hour with me. It is Eileen Cook and it is July 10th. And I'm doing sort of a little bit of a follow-up and a discussion that I thought was interesting that Bonnie and I started. Bonnie Jacoby, for those of you who are keeping track of which Bonnies, because we have many, around understanding what makes your story special. And this also came up because I'm working with another writer that I'm doing an edit on, and she was describing her book as one of those kind of, it's a YA meets a mystery meets an action thriller with a touch of paranormal. So we are trying to figure out, how do you sort of define your story, or how do you sort of narrow down what your story is about, or what makes your story stick out or be special. And this started with Bonnie, who has just joined us, talking about her dragon story and about feedback that she was getting in terms of people saying, yeah, but what makes your dragon story different? So I don't know, Bonnie, did you want to speak about what that experience was like, or what you were butting up against?
Um, yeah, it's, I feel like I'm putting in what's different, but I'm getting more the reaction that, yeah, you're explaining your world is different, but they're not getting how dragons that have riders and communicate with people is different than any other dragon story. Although I went looking and looking to see which dragon stories this is like. So all I can think is that it's too similar to old stories, from the 60s, 70s, 80s. Because the newer stories are more either for the YA, they're either schools where you
Yeah,
learn to be a dragon rider, or they're dragon shifters. They shift into humans
yeah.
and go to school and stuff. So I'm thinking that maybe it's because of an older trope. It's like when you're trying to do something and they say, "Oh, Hamlet's been done so many times."
We've seen Hamlet before. What else do you have?
Yeah.
Which I find is interesting, because I don't usually see that from agents, where but I wonder if they're butting up and they're not understanding how your dragon riders are different from the school dragon riders. I wonder if that is a thing. So what I'd like people to do is, I'm actually going to show them your query, if that's okay.
Yep.
And it's query number 1. So, and Lisa's asking about Aragon. So I don't know if you want to speak to that while I get your query up, Bonnie.
Yeah, that's the other one that people say, well, it's just like Aragon. How is it different than Aragon? Well, okay.
Get that all the time when I wrote with the angel books that I wrote, and
Yeah.
there was a billion differences, but they always but it was always really hard to articulate. And I'm only mentioning that because it's super difficult to articulate. Well, how is this different than my stepbrother Frank? It's like, I've never met your stepbrother Frank, or they don't even tell you, or my sister-in-law's second, and something you've never heard of, and it's their personal reference. And I find it
Yeah.
a difficult question, so I'm looking forward to seeing how we tackle this.
It's the articulation that's difficult. Like I could dump 1,000 things on them, but then they'd be really confused.
So I think one thing is, if you're having the opportunity where you're actually speaking with someone, I wonder if that's a really good time. And this is a counseling trick, is if you ever don't know what to say when you're counseling someone, you always boot it back to them to try and see if they can explain their question better. So I might be interested in saying something like, what things in my query is it that for you feel too familiar? To see if they can sort of say, well, it's this. And then you can be like, oh, okay, well, here's how that's only a small part of the story, or that's not what this is about, or it may give you something to build on. Now, I know that's not very helpful for written kinds of things because you don't have that back and forth. But if you are ever doing a personal pitch, that might be a place that I go. So I don't know if people have noticed, I have Bonnie's query up. So I'm going to leave it up for a second, and then I'm going to scroll upwards in just 1 minute. So I'll give people a chance to take a look at that. And then people give me a little flag when you want me to roll up a little bit. Not you, Bonnie. You already know the story. So for people who are looking at this later, the one thing I'm going to highlight that's just a general and that's not at all helpful to Bonnie because she knows this already, is I'm going to draw people's attention to sort of her last paragraph where she's giving her bio as just a really good example of using your bio to sort of show some of your personality and feelings. So I'm a member of SCBWI. I graduated of the Institute of Children's Literature. I attend writer conferences regularly. I totally believe dragons are real and they will return. I intend to be their champion against extinction. I love that because I think it just gives us such a fun feel of who she is. And I think a lot of times people are struggling to how do you put voice or feel into a query. And this is kind of a nice example of giving us just a hint to what Bonnie is like. So I am going to go for others. Are there any part of the query that anyone found confusing at all? We have a no on the confusing. Any part of the query that you would be suggesting, like that really intrigued you, that caught your eye? It's a silent crowd. Go ahead, Shalon, and then we'll go to Tracy.
First, I thought that it was really interesting. I definitely got a little bit of a feeling in my, like a little kind of excitement when I read the last paragraph. Gregor's power leads him to Becca, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, so it looks good. And I agree. I also like this last little line about I totally believe dragons are real and they will return. When I was reading the first two paragraphs, though, about Becca and then about Gregor, there was a lot of information. And it didn't have a lot of feeling, it was lacking kind of an emotional pull. I only got the emotional pull at the last paragraph. But I feel like there's a lot of information being conveyed that might not be necessary. And I don't know, if this is true or not, but I've heard that a query should only come from one character's perspective, even if there are two main characters. That's the industry standard, that a query only has one point of view. And also that that first sentence, 120,000 YA, it's 120,000 for a normal fantasy is okay, but I think 120,000 for a YA, even though it's fantasy, seems quite over the industry expectations. And then also that little statement with series potential. I know that agents tend to see that as a warning sign that the story isn't actually finished. So because people used to say the first in a series, and then it means the story's not finished. And then everybody started saying with series potential because they didn't want to say the first in a series, because agents started being like, no, we're not interested in the first of a series. So then they started saying with series potential, but now that's been hijacked by people who actually haven't got a standalone book. So agents now don't even like the words with series potential because it means that it has a big chance of meaning that the book isn't standalone, and they're not going to publish something that's not standalone by a debut author. So that's just what I've heard. Now I don't have personal experience with that, but I have heard agents in Surrey saying that series potential is no. So anyways, that's my thoughts on the query.
That's interesting because I haven't heard that particularly around YA. And that is because series is a huge driver in YA. Like if you look at the popular books, they're frequently series, and they're often more intrigued with series than standalone in some cases. They may not be able to sell a whole series, they'll admit that to you, but that's often what readers are wanting. I find the emotion bit is interesting, and so I want to cycle back to that because I think that one's going to be interesting. And then for other people, 120,000 as a YA fantasy would also be okay. I certainly have seen that, and I would say YAs are skewing longer. They're much more likely now to be adult length, so we're talking kind of that 80 to 90,000 words is fairly common right now for a YA, so bumping up for a fantasy. It is on the longer end of that, like there's no doubt about that, but it wouldn't be necessarily a huge red flag, I don't think. I'm going to go over to Tracy to hear your thoughts, because I want to cycle back eventually to what Shalon talked about with emotion, because I think that's really intriguing and got some places to dig in. Tracy.
Yeah, so as someone who read almost exclusive fantasy of this style back when I was growing up, I read this as I would read like Dragon Riders of Pern and stuff like that. So I don't know Last Samsara or Serafina, but when I read this, I went, oh, Dragon Riders of Pern. So I kind of got that wonderful, fuzzy feeling of some really good teen fantasy back in my day. But the only confusing part for me, but I talked to you because I knew Gregor was a dragon, but the way I kind of read it, I thought, a 17-year-old, oh, he's a teenage boy. No, he's a dragon. So I was, at that point, I was a little confused because I always picture dragons, even young dragons, over like 100. Like once they start getting to 100 or 150 years. Now that's just traditional fantasy. It doesn't mean really anything, but that was just a personal.
Yeah, I had no idea that Gregor was a dragon.
I kind of got it from based on what she was talking about, the coven and the link and stuff like that. But when you said 17 years, I'm like, that's like a baby dragon, like super baby. So that's just a
baby dragons. I love that. I think that's interesting because I know Gregor is a dragon because, of course, I've read this. But I actually had that same thing, something about, I think even just somehow we have to make it crystal clear that Gregor is a dragon.
But for me, I like that in the very first sentence you put a fantasy with multiple points. So kind of, not that, I kind of actually like that. You described it from both Becca's and Gregor's point of view, like you put both of their points of view in the query because the book is from both of their points of view. So when you read the back of like a fantasy book, it will usually have multiple points of view and you'll see like the breakdown. Becca, blah, 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 and then it'll have like a little squiggly fun little design, and then it'll talk about the point of view of the other main character. So for me, that actually is kind of cool because I know that I'm going to be going into this book. Like if I was to like say, oh yeah, I think this would be a good book for me to pick up as an agent. I know that there are 2 points of view and they're both as important to you to let me know. Like if you're letting me know that there's 2 points of view, obviously it's a very important part of the book. So I think for me, that's actually a good thing. And I'm going to be aware that going into starting to read this book, I'm going to be going from Becca's to Gregor's point of view. So I actually like that.
And yeah, I wonder, and I don't read enough dragon books, so I don't know how often you get the dragon's point of view. But in terms of when we talk about when things are different, I don't know if that is one of the things that the dragon is an equal opportunity character in these books, right? Like it is a dual, it's not just an occasional insight from the dragon point of view, like the dragon is one of the main characters. Alyssa.
So hopefully you'll be able to hear me. My internet's been a little bad. Yeah, I agree with Tracy in that I don't feel like an emotional bit. I feel like there's, too many words and too much description, and that you're telling the conflict instead of showing it maybe. I don't know. So I have read the book, and I feel like for me as a reader, the most exciting part of the book is when, in the early book, is when the dragon rider falls off, and then that sort of launches her into her journey. So I don't know if you can incorporate that, because like that's the inciting incident kind of, right, where the rider falls off and she realizes dragons are real, and that sort of, so I don't know, I feel like maybe you could take out all the deep mountain range, because that's all sort of backstory anyway, right? yeah, and then the magic flooding back into the world, maybe you don't need it. And then I feel like maybe you can tighten up that first paragraph, just to try to get it across in few words. Yeah, like even just maybe just having her entire life is mapped out from her mother, or maybe just taking out one or two of the examples. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, I feel like that the dragon riding and the dragon flying and that sense of magic and whimsy is missing from the query.
I was wondering about whether or not the query should open with when dragons wake after a 150-year-old sleep, magic is released back into the world. And then giving us kind of the two things, what that means for 16-year-old Becca, whose entire life has been mapped out by her mom. Now suddenly she can sense other people's feelings and is forced to flee where she has always grown up, right? And then for Gregor, and just kind of going with those kinds of things, because I would agree, I think it was Shalon who sort of talked about this last paragraph where you say, Gregor's power leads him to Becca. There's a lot of great stuff going on in that paragraph because we're getting all the stakes. She's got to decide which version of the truth, the plague could come back, everything's that's just such a super powerful paragraph. So I would highlight maybe getting to that a little bit more quickly. Now I want to ask Bonnie, what do you think makes your story unique and special? If you were to say, and I think this would be an interesting exercise for other people, because I was thinking about it in general, but also obviously for Bonnie in particular. And as I mentioned, talking to some other people who have been working on books that have, multiple things, they're a mystery with a bit of paranormal, with a little touch of this, is kind of sitting down and being like, okay, what is the main genre that my book is in? And, again, I was talking about someone recently and they were like, I think my main genre is a mystery. And I was like, I don't. I think you have mystery elements in your book, but I don't think the main thrust is a mystery. I think there's other stuff that is the bigger part of the book. If you want the main thrust to be a mystery, then you've got a different rewrite on your hands. So first taking the moment to say, okay, this is a dragon fantasy. That is the primary thing that's happening in this book. And then thinking, okay, well, what kinds of tropes or cliches go with that? Or in Lisa's example, if you've written a book that's an angel book at a time where, fallen angels are all the rage, or a vampire book, or, insert police procedural thriller or whatever it is, certain kind of romances. Of course, I can't think of a single one at the moment that all sort of fall into certain categories, and sort of saying, okay, what are the tropes or expectations of that genre? And then kind of drawing yourself a line and then saying, what is it that makes my story special or unique? And trying to think about that. So at the risk of putting you completely on the spot, Bonnie, what is it that you think makes your story different than other dragon stories?
Well, certainly having the dragon point of view and having the dragon as a teen, as opposed to an old, ancient, 50-year-old, 100-year-old dragon. I kind of feel like the trope is often that they are older and either wiser, or they're, there's just as many tropes for banding with the dragon as there are for fighting the dragon. So, yeah. But there are fewer stories that have to do with connecting with the dragon, and those people that have done it, such as Dragon Riders of Pern or Aragon, they're quite popular because they are actually in the fewer range. There's more attacking of dragons, or the dragon has come to destroy the village, sort of thing. The other thing that I think is different about mine is that I'm taking a more YA approach. So it's a lot more grounded in the teen coming of age, discovering themselves, a lot more than the dragon stories that I read, because a lot of them were more usually older characters, and so it was more plot driven, and they had a quest or they're being heroic, but you don't have that in-depth thing that you tend to get with YA, which is I don't know, a tighter look at coming of age. And
So
my
one thing
magic,
yeah.
my magic doesn't show up in there.
So two things that strike me when you're talking about that is when you're talking about coming of age, I am more inclined than even and I think it was Alyssa who wanted to take out some of the things about 16-year-old Becca, partly because one of the example is everything from who she'll marry. Just even though she is 16, to me that makes her older all of a sudden, because she's confronting things like who she'll marry. And granted, this is a very different world, one in which you might get married at a very young age. But I would definitely maybe lean towards taking that out. And I do think that we've lost, I don't think it's clear for people always that Gregor is the dragon. So I don't even, like, it might even be as simple as, 17-year-old dragon, Gregor.
Yeah, it's awkward though.
Yeah.
But
Making that particularly really clear, I think is going to be important, because I do think the fact that he is different is useful. Now, Lisa, how did you go about trying to show in your angel books that something was different? That might help the bandwidth a little bit.
How did I go about? I found myself just banging my head against a wall, quite frankly. So to be perfectly honest, Bonnie, I know the struggle. I talked about, you tried to character. One of the things is that one of the things you were seeing is that the girl was hapless and the angels were in charge. She gets swept up in their world. So I would try to show how the character had agency. Other things is like, I just couldn't do it. Honestly, I ended up with a small press because, I was at a time when the market was absolutely super saturated or was getting super saturated. But I focused on character and being different and how the world was a little bit different. And I would just make I would try to show that in the, and I would try to show that in the query as much as I could, or in the synopsis. I focused on the past life link, I think, because I found that was different rather than just, oh, it's an angel. This is an angel this girl knew. And that definitely was the case, but I focused on that more. I put an emphasis on something that was, so it's a different spin. I mean, there's everybody's written, every story's ever been written, and I find that everybody's super flippant, jaded about it. And, it's more like, who's my friend, or who do I want to read, or what struck me as different. And I'm a little bit jaded about that right now. So I'm going to stop talking.
I think it is a challenge to figure out how to make your query reflect your voice, because I think, Lisa, you put your finger on something which is true, which is, even if you look at a lot of books out there, they're not necessarily wildly different from each other. And I'm not sure that wildly different is always great. Like if suddenly Bonnie said, and in addition to dragons, there were flying toasters. That's how my book is different. There are alien toasters in addition to dragons. Like, well, it would be different. It would stand out from the other books out there, but not necessarily in a good way, right? So you're trying to figure out what that is. And I think that's one of the reasons I like your last line, is there's an earnestness to it. Like, I believe dragons are real, that is sort of reflected in the story. Like there's an honest earnestness to the characters, having read them and sort of knowing who they are. So I like that is in there. So I think I would agree with some of the feedback that has come, that I might shorten up those initial first two paragraphs and do something where, once magic is unleashed back into the world, these two characters struggle to figure out now what to do. 17-year-old, for a dragon, 17 years old is just hardly but a baby. So for Gregor to try and offer any kind of leadership, no one takes him seriously. So you're kind of putting the thrust on his maybe coming of age challenge. And then for Becca, now that magic is unleashed, she knows what people are really thinking and feeling. So she has to confront some ugly truths and decide to go out on her own. If that makes sense. I do want to flag in the chat, because I'm not sure if you saw it, Bonnie, because I think it's a good comment that Alyssa made, which is if Gregor's 17 and 150 years passes, it's not clear if he's frozen or if he's aged in that time. So he is frozen, like basically he goes to bed at 17 and wakes up at 17. But that is a good point where it might be confusing for some people. And I think, setting up so people understand that dragons are, considerably older is useful. For everybody who is sort of confronting this issue, I do think it's useful to figure out what your book has in common with things that are successful, and then trying to identify how or where yours is different. And it might be in tone, it might be, I think certainly for Lisa, having read her angel books and having read other angel books, it really was around character agency. Her main character was not a shy, retiring kind of violet girl, like who needed this angel to save her. Like she was on top of things before that. And I think also the past life did kind of go into that. Have other people struggled with this or heard this feedback from people, and how have they dealt with it? Anyone else? Has it come up for Tracy? How about you, Alyssa? Has it been a thing?
It actually happened with my
Sorry,
friend.
can you repeat the question?
Alyssa, have you ever had, have you gotten any feedback like, oh, how is your Amazon story different than, let's say, Lisa's? Like, this is actually an interesting comparison because you and Lisa are both writing Amazon stories. Have you guys read each other's stories?
No,
No.
we haven't yet. I'd like to. I just, I would love that, actually. I'm at that point where I'm ready to have it read. Mine is not
I'm
historically.
torn. Like, I worry that I'm too close to Amazons and that I will try to make your Amazons like my Amazons.
Me too. Sometimes it's hard to read something really close to what you're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I've seen snippets of both of your books, right? So for me, there definitely is some very distinct differences. So certainly, I think the biggest difference being for Lisa's book is a fish out of water to some degree. So it's a modern day character who is going back to this world and having to sort of make sense of it from a modern day sort of thing. And I think there's the nice dichotomy there between what she, when she goes back, it's, she knows things like the Heimlich maneuver, which makes her like a genius for the Amazons, right? Like, holy cow, you're like a total healer person. But of course, in the end, she ends up realizing that the things that they know teach her so much more about herself than what she's bringing to the past. Versus Alyssa's story, which to me truly is a wonderful sibling story. And it is about that relationship between the two sisters. And it could almost be set, I think it's fun because it's set in Amazonian times, but it could be, a contemporary story set someplace else, right? Like it could be two girls dealing with, issues in Serbia or that kind of thing. Like, I think it's fun that it's set in Amazon, but it's really about kind of owning your own power and understanding that power comes from different places. Feel free to write any of this down if any way, shape, or form is it helpful. Now, Bonnie, you said you've had this happen to you with your other book as well. Can you talk about that?
Yes, with my YA science fiction, I kept getting the same feedback. It sounds the same as anything else. What makes yours different? I'm like, I'm putting all these details in. So my tendency is to add more information, and then it's too information heavy and people get confused. So I'm like, damn it, it's happening again. And it's just, I feel that it's so hard. I'm so close to the story, it's hard to pick out just the snippets that will entice people. And I think I tend to try to back them up by giving explanations as to why this is important in my world. And so then the actual emotion connection to the character gets lost, which is why I keep rewriting these darn queries, trying to get to the heart of what the story is about. And of course, by the time you write 10, you decide that your story's broken, you don't know what the heck you're doing, and you may as well just forget about it, because obviously if you can't write a query letter, my story must be broken. Yes, I do have a log line. I'd have to look it up, Alyssa. Eileen has it, I think. But for the...
Is it in the information you sent me?
Yes. For
Okay,
the
I'll
science
find it.
fiction, what I eventually had to do was actually pull details from almost the end of the story to show how it was different. And I really struggled with that because, you don't want to give away certain twists and turns, but in a query letter, sometimes you do have to. And that might be the case here, that I'm not getting the uniqueness, because
I don't think you do have a log line, my dear. I think you lied. I'm going to show.
I did not lie.
You have 2 pitches,
Oh, the pitches. The pitches will do.
but that's not a log line.
I will go get it.
Log line is
Ask someone else a question, and I'll go find my log line.
just, I'm letting people take a look at the pitches. Shalon, did you have a comment? I sensed you were going to say something there.
I was just I'm going to say that, I found a lot of help from Absolute Right. It's a forum. It's a pretty vicious place. I wouldn't recommend it for your fiction, but for the query letter, it helped me so much. I mean, my query letter, when it went into there and when it came out, was like not even remotely the same. There's a lot of published authors there that will give feedback on your query letter. So if that's something you're interested in, then you might want to consider it.
And I think one thing to keep in mind is, and it's frustrating when you're going through the process of query letters, and we haven't really touched on this yet, although you kind of hinted at it, Ani, is what pulls one person into the story is a turnoff for someone else. But if they knew there was another part of the story, they might be sucked into it. So, one person might be totally fascinated with this fact and someone else might be pulled out by it. So sometimes it's trying to figure out or even changing up your query letter depending on who or what you're doing it for. So that is something that comes up. Keeping track of things. It's called Absolute Right. I got your back. And it's a free forums. And so you can join the forums is no problem. If you go to their website, which is absoluteright.com, you'll see their forums are up in the right-hand side. And so you can join those.
I do just want to warn, though, that it is really vicious. Like the people there's like no holds bars critiquing. So it's not for everybody. And especially do not post your fiction if you haven't been on there for a while and seen how they operate, because they're very vicious. And but for queries, for me personally, I'm not attached to my query. I just want the very best. I'm not emotionally attached to my query. I just want the best. I want the best standard, industry standard, professional query that I can get. So I found that, and I'm really, really very helpful. And probably 30 people reviewed my query, including a woman. She's actually a really pretty famous YA writer, Adrienne Kress, I believe. She's pretty hot right now. She reviewed my query. Like personally, though, she sent me a personal private one because she can't really post on the forum these days. But yeah, she sent me a personal one. And a lot of really successful authors actually use it because they used it when they were starting out, and so they try to give back to the community. So
Yeah, Absolute Writer also is really good. You'll see a lot of people will post, hey, I recently queried Eileen Cook and I haven't heard. Has anyone else been hearing from her? And other people might, chime in like, yeah, it took her 6 months to get back to me, those kinds of things. So sometimes there's some interesting help that way. They're very honest about their experiences. I thought Shalom was going to say something, so that's why I was pausing. I was like, she's about to speak something smart. I don't want to get in the middle of that.
I was looking for the log line. I didn't see it, but I found it.
And I think it's interesting. I don't know if people have seen it, but when dragons return after 150 years sleep, they release magic into the world. And now one abused girl with an unwanted empathetic powers and a young dragon blamed for the loss of those years must find the strength to fight for themselves before dragons become extinct again. I love that line. And I'm thinking that needs to be way moved up. Other people's thoughts? Alyssa likes it, but
yes, it's fabulous. It's me, the voice in the corner.
It's good to hear the voice in the corner.
Really good.
I think it's really great too. I would somehow shorten it a tiny bit. Like instead of unwanted empathic powers, I would just say unwanted powers.
Yeah.
And just maybe, because the empathic powers are great, but it's the unwanted, she's got powers and she doesn't want them. So there's automatic conflict. I would take out, see, the young dragon blamed for the loss all those years. Also excellent stakes, excellent character. If you could find a way to shorten that, maybe the young dragon thought responsible or,
I like blamed.
Yeah.
Or the young blamed.
For the loss, and then instead of all those years or something. Anyway, I just shorten it a tiny bit, but I think it's excellent.
Now Bonnie's like, damn it. Yeah, I think
knowing what things work for other people. To me, everything I write, it's all the same story. So I can't see how it's being read by other people. That helps.
so. Hang on, because I'm going to confuse things further. So let me, because Bonnie gave us multiple queries. So this was her second version of it. But I think what you should be aware of, at least for me, is in that first paragraph, there's no hint that he's necessarily a dragon until it gets to the source which protected the last surviving dragon. So his new family could just be dead people. So that's not good. I'll let people take a look at that one. And for those of you who have read Query 2, fear not, there's more. Now Bonnie's hating that she sent the queries in. She's like, damnation. But I think it's probably interesting for people because they're also getting more of the story. But it is, I think it's just things are getting lost in the details. So I'm going to take people back to the log line. And I'm just looking through because you now have a couple different versions. So Lisa suggested, when dragons return after 150 years sleep, they release magic into the world. And now one abused girl with unwanted empathetic powers.
I was just copying it for Tracy because Tracy said her connection
I was
dropped.
like, you left the same one, Lisa.
No, but if you notice, I said, hi, Tracy. Bonnie said this.
Oh, yeah. Now that makes more sense to me. Yeah.
Michelle, and we both repeated it for Tracy so she wouldn't, because her connection dropped.
Here, I thought you guys were redoing it for her. I was like, oh, well, that's not nice.
I redid one for her. Mine's mine's an edited version.
Yeah, because they took empathetic out for an abused girl with unwanted powers and a young dragon blamed for those lost years must, I like that, lost years, must find the strength to fight for themselves. Write that one down, Bonnie. It's a good one. So I think one of the things that is, and it's interesting here. Tracy's saying the query 2 tells us about Gregor's power, which is what intrigues her. I'm sorry. I'm thinking as I go. I'm trying to figure out even if you took the log line as your starting place and then gave us a tiny bit about Becca and a tiny bit about Gregor, that might let you just mention their personal things and then go to the third paragraph.
Then I could skip all the world building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's something about magic being released into the world that I love. And I think something about getting the sense of, one abused girl, and that each of them to some degree have these unwanted powers that they need to have because that's what's actually going to make them able to survive and thrive. So I think what's interesting, and it kind of reminds me of what Shalon is talking about with her experiences, is the query letter is one, like when I look back at my own, and I will dig it out for you, like it is so old. I actually have it typed out in my file somewhere because that is how old I am. When we were still sending queries by mail with envelopes and everything. And certainly my query letter is nothing to write home about that actually got me an agent. I do think one part of that was it was a different time in terms of you actually had to spend a stamp to send out a query. It required a trip to the post office. So I'm not certain that they were necessarily getting the sheer volume. They were just switching over to email queries when I started. And I think that does increase the amount of queries that agents are getting in general. So I think they're skimming much more, and it is a little bit harder to sort of figure out how do you grab their attention and what works for one doesn't work for another. But I think the exercise of sitting down and saying to yourself, what is it that makes my story special, or what is it that motivated me to write this story? Like if you were to sit down with us and be like, this is why this story is important, this is why I wanted to tell it, and then asking yourself if there is any of that in the query. Because I think sometimes we focus so much on what makes our story different, but it's also what that passion is, what's that feel, and if you can bring that about. I'm going to use an example for Lisa. She was talking about her story with some agents at Surrey last time, and they were like, And then she started talking about her own, like she wanted to write this story because she wanted to write about a main character who was tall and plus sized and having this, and all of a sudden the agent sparked to life. Can you tell that story in better detail, Lisa? I'm telling it secondhand and I wasn't there.
Oh, do you mean when I was talking to that? Yeah, they'd ask me, like I talked about the story, and then she asked me, well, why do you want to write it? And then I talked about how I've been, how I grew up tall and plus size, just like Bridget, my main character, and just how I was always hoping to I was curious about what it would have been like to live in a pre-patriarchal world, and what it was also like to be, have a main character who was a woman who was different, who was like, my body size is not necessarily represented in anything other than fat stories, about being fat and, accepting yourself for being fat, as opposed to being in a fantasy genre, which is true equality, is having different body sizes and types in all different types of stories. So that's sort of what I don't know, I was ranting, I was, high on that terror that you get when you talk to an agent, but I remember exactly.
There's nothing like abject terror to sort of make things exciting. But I think what's interesting, and even as you're talking there, I think the passion starts to come out, and it starts to be like, we need a fantasy story where the goal is not like, oh, and then because she's figured out who she is, she loses weight and becomes a size 6 and kicks ass and takes names. But it's like, no, this is who she is, and she comes to love and, be that person. And that's what sort of takes over that story. So thinking about not just what makes your story different, because I think sometimes then we're stretching to find things that aren't the important part of it, but thinking about what is it that excites you about that story and what made you want to tell it. And if I go all the way back to Bonnie, when you were doing very early drafts of this story, and you were talking about the idea of learning to live on your own and wanting to write a main character who's trying so hard to please other people and has to come to a point where she realizes that you can't necessarily, like, that was a core part of your story that's still there. Other things have changed around it, but that is still a part of that. And looking to see, and I think that's part of what I think I like that comes about in that log line, is they have to find the strength to fight for themselves. And that's that passion that then makes it stick out to me and makes it a bit stronger. So I think I really encourage people to think about that. Because that's what makes, and again, if you think about when someone talks to you about a story, it's one of two things. So there are some people who they sort of mention a hook, and that's when you hear the term high concept. So I recently bought a book strictly based off the blurb, which was a serial killer who, and I'm going to screw this up because they did it much more fancy than this, but it was basically a serial killer who manages always to get on the jury. So he always sets up someone else to take the fall for his crimes. So he's always on the jury that's convicting someone for the murder that he actually did. And it was like, oh, what an interesting concept, right? And so I was curious to see that story. And I enjoyed the book, but not a ton. Like, often the books that I like are clearly hard for people to describe, but it'll be the feeling that they often sometimes put behind it. So the book that I recommended a lot last year was Eleanor Oliphant's Is Completely Fine, which, if you try to describe the story, it's about an autistic main character who's learning to find relationships, but it's quirky, and it's all about loving yourself and learning to trust in other people. And it's the feelings behind that book that are what sticks out to me. So identifying not just the difference, but identifying your passion, I think will make a huge difference in trying to do that. And it certainly comes up, I think, if you're pitching in person, and I don't know how many people are planning to go to conferences, but that's often certainly the things where your excitement comes across, and that makes them want to feel and be a part of that, which I think is huge. And it's also useful if you're just struggling to write in general, like taking a time off and remembering, like, there was a reason you wanted to write that story. There was something that excited you about that story. So if you're in the point where you're stuck and it's like, the story is horrible, and in fact, I'm horrible, and everything is horrible now that I think about it, is just pausing and being like, there was something about that story that you loved, something about that story that made you want to write it, that got you excited for it. So if you're lost in the weeds with that, just taking a moment to remember that is useful for yourself, and posting it for yourself, and then write it down, because when it comes time to write the query, that might be helpful for you. All right. Other thoughts on this or on anything that people wanted to talk about? All right. So that is my challenge to you guys. So we, for those of you who were able to make the retreat on Saturday, it is recorded if you weren't able to make it. But we did a lot of talk about yourself as the hero of your own story and kind of going through this. And so I think that's the interesting thing to think about, your motivation to want to be a writer. And something is driving you towards wanting to do that, and touching base with that can really help. Bonnie.
Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. I have tons of notes, and I even noted down which little bits of query resonated with people, because then I'm going to really examine them and figure out why. But it almost seemed like the conclusion was drop all the information and try to keep all the emotion. I'll just do that.
I mean, I think it's enough that people know that there's a quest to save the dragons.
Yeah.
And that
my log line actually works, and maybe I should use that. That's also very good information. So thank you.
I think it makes a difference. All right. And so until then, everyone continue to be the hero of their story. Write those things down. Get to the end. Stick through that dark night of the soul. And we'll see you all on the other side. All right, everybody. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.